Welcome to AML Conversations, the Solution Series. This podcast series focuses on practical information about solutions to challenges you face in your financial crime compliance program. These solutions include managed services, technology, advisory, and third-party risk management. You can access this series and other AML Conversations and This Week in AML podcasts at our website, amlrightsource.com, SoundCloud, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, Josh. Hi, John. Welcome back to the Solution Series.
Hi, Rachel. Great to be here.
Hey, Rachel. How's it going? Good to see you again.
I'm good. Thanks, Josh. And yeah, it's great to have you both back. So today's episode, we're going to be covering tuning and optimization. And I wondered if either of you could kick us off and kind of explain why financial institutions have to do tuning and optimization and what the regulatory prescriptions are for it.
Yeah, I think I'll just jump in there, Rachel. And I think there's probably a lot of reasons that tuning should be performed on monitoring systems. Tuning really helps you optimize your system so that you can generate the most accurate outcomes and results. And in return, you should be gaining highly valuable insights into your customers and data. And really having those insights can help you make the most effective business decisions about your program. Things like risk coverage, through the tuning exercise, maybe you identify a gap in coverage and you need to add additional control to your program, or the opposite could happen where you're able to identify redundant scenarios and really can help produce better output in that instance. Tuning can really help improve with the effectiveness and accuracy of the system, and incorporating tuning into your ongoing monitoring plan and rolling it up into your governance framework should really enhance your overall compliance program. And then leveraging the output of your tuned system and reviewing reporting dashboards, key performance indicators can really also help you with your staffing plan, your strategic business plan, and can also be used for cost and budget analysis as well. But another good reason that you should be performing tuning is the regulators are really expecting it to be conducted. And a couple of the regs, specifically the FFIEC BSA AML exam manual, it says that the level of monitoring should be dictated by the institution's assessment of risk, with emphasis on high-risk products, services, customers, and geographic locations. It also goes into saying that management should periodically evaluate the appropriateness of filtering criteria and thresholds used in the monitoring process. And each financial institution should evaluate and identify filtering criteria most appropriate for their institution. Another reg that's pretty important that we've been working with our clients is the New York DFS Part 504 regulation. And within that regulation, your program really should be periodically updated at risk-based intervals to reflect new regulations. It should comply with your current AML risks to your institution's risk profile. And really, it also says your rules should have the appropriate thresholds, values, and amounts. You should perform pre and post testing of your detection scenarios and thresholds. And ultimately, you're required to have documentation to support those detection scenarios and parameters and thresholds. And lastly, part of the 504 is again going back to being able to conduct ongoing analysis of your detection scenarios, based on triggering events or occurrences when you're required to do so. Another big regulation. The OCC 11-12 Model Risk Management Guidelines, FRB 11-7 guidelines, recently in the 2021 OCC Safety and Soundness Handbook, they all have sections under outcome analysis that actually define the general requirements for tuning. And it also lists various approaches that you can use to perform tuning.
Hey, John, jump in there for one sec. So it sounds like from what you're saying from the regs, none of them really specifically says you have to do tuning this often, right? It's risk-based, it should be regular, but they don't exactly say it's got to be every 12 months or every 24 months, do they?
Yeah, and it's really depends. It could be event driven, depends on, if changes into your environment. If you're doing a merger or acquisition, maybe you're going to implement a new product or a service in a different jurisdiction. There's usually a triggering event that you build into your ongoing monitoring plan. And if that event occurs, then you would already have your plan developed and you would execute that plan once that event happens.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. Like you might introduce a new product, for example, like that might be an event that triggers a retuning, right? Or you might take on a new geographic segment. That might trigger a retuning. But the idea that there are specific risk kind of events that should trigger you to think about engaging in this kind of exercise, I think is an important point.
Yep. Yeah. And just one or two more, for example, if you're implementing a new system, right, you want to do pre-tuning and post-tuning as well. So there's lots of different events that could occur. And really, if you think about what they are and document them and build them into your ongoing monitoring plan, then you have a clear direction on when you should perform that tuning exercise.
I have a question, and this goes back to what you said, John, about there being improved effectiveness, accuracy, enhanced compliance. If there are such clear benefits to do tuning and optimization, and it has a positive impact on system performance, why do financial institutions avoid this exercise?
That's a great question, Rachel. I think for most institutions, it's a painful exercise, especially on the transaction monitoring side, which we're going to get into more in just a moment here. There is an awful lot involved, depending especially on what kind of system you have running and how many transaction monitoring scenarios you have running. This is an exercise that can be incredibly time-consuming and incredibly labor-consuming. And so I think most institutions just find it painful because it sucks up a lot of time and resources. And something we'll maybe talk about in one of our future episodes is what are some of the ways we can make it be a little bit less painful, and what are some of the strategies that institutions use to do that?
There are obviously different systems, different environments, but I'd like to go back to what you said there, Josh, in terms of from the transaction monitoring perspective or side, that it's a really painful exercise. Can we hone in on that or have a perspective or lens for tuning and optimization just from a transaction monitoring perspective? And would you be able to provide a little bit more detail on that?
Yeah, let's dig into some of those details, and I'm glad you said from a TM perspective. We're going to focus in the next few minutes really on the transaction monitoring piece of things. And then in some of our subsequent episodes, we're going to talk in more detail about what tuning looks like for sanctions or for CDD or for fraud, because honestly, for each of those types of AML systems, the tuning and optimization really looks quite different. So for the next few minutes, let's just talk about the transaction monitoring piece of things and what tuning and optimization looks like there, and some of the things we here at AML RightSource think it's important to focus on when you're doing tuning and optimization. And the first, John really already covered it at a high level at the beginning. It really all starts with the coverage assessment, right? So it starts with saying to yourself, what kind of geographies does my financial institution serve? What kind of products do we have? What's our risk profile? What's our risk appetite? And then thinking carefully about whether or not the transaction monitoring scenarios you have in place adequately address those customer types, those geographies, those product types, your risk appetite, your risk profile, and making sure those things line up. And, John talked earlier about two flavors of that, and I think each of them is equally important when we're talking about tuning and optimization. And the first piece John mentioned is gaps, right? So looking across your products, for example, and saying, all right, I offer these kinds of loans, for example. Do I have specific transaction monitoring scenarios that address loans, right? Or, I have these kinds of trade products that I offer. Do I have transaction monitoring scenarios that specifically handle trade-based money laundering and that look at trade transactions? So it's really making sure that whatever your geographies, customers, and products are, you have transaction monitoring scenarios in place that address all of those adequately. So that's the first piece of the coverage assessment. But then the second piece, which I think is equally important for tuning and optimization, is making sure that you don't have too much duplication or too much overlap. And what do I mean by that? Well, just like you don't want to have gaps in your coverage, you also don't want to have, let's say, 3 or 5 different scenarios that really are overlapping and looking at the same thing. So for example, we'll find that very often there are, in different kinds of systems, there are rules that look at something over a short period of time, let's say 3 days or a week. And then there are similar rules that look at something over a long period of time, say a month. But if you have both the short period and long period rules in place, the long period is generally going to be capturing most of the things that the short period rule caught. So there's a potential for significant amounts of overlap there, depending on how things are tuned and set up. Similarly, we often see cases where financial institutions have rules in place, for example, for excessive types of transaction. Then they'll also have rules in place for deviation from historical behavior for that type of transaction. And let's say if we're looking at cash, then they'll also have a structuring rule in place. And so depending on where your thresholds are set, it could be that your excessive rule, your deviation rule, and your structuring rule are really all overlapping each other and triggering on many of the same things. So you're getting duplicate or sometimes even triplicate alerts. So one of the big things we want to do when we're starting out at the beginning of a tuning and optimization exercise is make sure you don't have gaps in your coverage, but also making sure you don't have too much overlap in your coverage so that you're spitting out 2 or 3 alerts for every one alert that you really need to be looking at. So that's really the first big piece. Yeah, John, were you going to jump in there?
Yeah, I was just going to add another, important thing. I think is really, like you touched upon, is the customer segmentation, and I think you were going there, Josh, and really, understanding the coverage, through your coverage assessment, understanding what are the segments that you have, be it, the customer types, your product types, account types, transaction activity, and how you could segment that within your AML platform, and obviously it depends on the limitations and the technology that you use as well. And one more thing, and I'll give it back to you, Josh. I think a key component before you get into tuning also is really looking at your data quality to ensure that you have, quality data for your AML or sanctions platform, where when you conduct that tuning exercise, you have the optimum output that you can get from the system.
Absolutely. The data quality is so important. And, I want to go back to the segments that you were just referring to a minute ago, John. And really doing a thorough review of your segmentation as part of the initial stages of tuning and optimization is so important. And for those folks maybe less familiar with segmentation, also sometimes called population groups, let's just talk about them for a second at the really high level. So segments, for example, might be separating the thresholds that you have for individuals on one hand versus entities or corporations on the other hand, right? If I'm looking, let's say, at excessive wire transactions, well, a level of wire transaction that's reasonable for me, a private guy, is going to probably be quite different than a level of wire transactions that might be different for a corporation that has 20,000 people in it. So it's important to segment your thresholds so that they're, appropriately looking at things through a different lens, such as, again, individuals versus corporations. And another really common example of segmentation is things like segmenting between your high-risk customers and your non-high-risk customers. So this actually starts to get us into the next piece of things, which I was going to talk about, which is reasonability, the reasonability check on your thresholds. But for example, if you're segmenting things by high-risk customers versus not high-risk customers, which is quite common out there, and we generally recommend it, you want to make sure that your high-risk customers are getting scrutinized more carefully than your not high-risk customers. So generally, that means they should have a lower threshold. So, for example, if I might think that $10,000 for monthly wire transfers is a reasonable threshold level for an individual, I might decide that if you're a high-risk individual, I'm going to set that threshold at $6,000 instead of $10,000 because I want to scrutinize your activity more carefully. So the segmentation piece of things is really important. And again, this kind of leads us into the next piece. So after we've looked at the coverage assessment and your scenarios, make sure there's no gaps, no big overlaps, and we've looked at how you're segmenting things, then we generally like to do what we call a sanity check or a reasonableness check on the thresholds that you have in place. And let's talk about a couple of examples of those. One of them I already hinted at. So, for example, if you have segments for high-risk customers and non-high-risk customers, you want to make sure that your thresholds for the high-risk customers are set lower than the thresholds for your not high-risk customers. But frequently when we go in to do a tuning exercise, we'll see that this is not always the case. So that's a kind of, low-hanging fruit where you want to say, hey, this seems a little odd. You've got a higher threshold for your high-risk customers. They should be scrutinized more carefully. Similarly, between individuals and entities, like I mentioned a moment ago, usually your entity-level thresholds are going to be set considerably higher than your individual thresholds because what I do as a private guy for a month is going to look really different than what a corporation does for a month. And we want the thresholds to reflect that so that you're not having very high thresholds for an individual, in which case I would never alert, or very low thresholds for an entity, in which case they'd just be alerting all the time. So you want to make sure that your thresholds at a super high level kind of pass a sanity check, and similarly, you want to make sure that the numbers on those thresholds don't look too surprising. Like, for example, if we start a tuning exercise and we see that thresholds for several rules or segments are set, let's just say, for example, at $10 million. Well, that's going to catch our attention, right? And we're going to want to dig into that a little. Maybe that's perfectly reasonable, but a $10 million threshold would require some explaining as to why it's set at that level.
Josh, I know that you have limited time, so let's stop there for today and dig back into this data analysis and how rules and heuristics are applied during our next episode. So thank you both for joining me today, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Sounds good. Thanks both. Take care.
Thanks, Josh. Thanks, Rachel.
Thanks for listening to this episode of AML Conversations, the Solution Series. More episodes will be posted in the coming months. If you find this installment interesting, there is more great content at amlrightsource.com. If we can help you with your financial crime compliance needs, schedule a meeting on our website. Together, we can reimagine compliance.